Alright guys, it's been a while, but here are your notes on population ecology. I apologize in advance for any errors because, well, I've been trying to get these things done and get multiple ones done at once, and let's move into it. So a few definitions. A population is a group of individuals of the same species who are living in the same place at the same time. So if you pick an area, let's say, the city of Dallas or the region of Oak Cliff, and you talk about all of the squirrels in that area, well, as long as you're talking about squirrels of the same species, then you are talking about a population. So the individuals in a population interact with each other, and they also interact with their environment in many ways that we're going to look at throughout the course of this lesson. So some of the things that organisms do is they compete for the same resources, they're all subject to the same environmental conditions, and a big one, they all interact and interbreed with each other. In fact, that's, remember, one of the definitions of a species, that they can interbreed. There are a couple of other terms that we need to be familiar with. So population density is the number of individuals per unit of area or volume. When you're talking about volume, that's more likely to be in an aquatic ecosystem, just because you're talking about a cubic meter of water. The population size is the total number of individuals in that population. And you can talk about small populations, like you could talk about a local population of the number of ants in an anthill in your backyard. Or you could talk about a much larger population, the population of ants in, your entire city block. So here is an example of two different populations. They differ in both population size and population density. Obviously, the one on the bottom has a larger size and has a greater density. All right. So it's really impractical to go out there and count every single organism in a population, especially if it's a remote population, hard to get to, or they're tiny and they're hard to find. So ecologists use a lot of different methods to try and estimate the population of an area. So there are things like Quadra Sampling, which basically you take a standardized square or hoop. It doesn't matter as long as you use the same one for each sample that you're collecting. So a standard is to use like a 1 meter by 1 meter square. And then you can do random quadrant sampling, where you just kind of toss that square out, and in a random spot you count all the members of a specific species that you can find in there. And then what you can do, you do this for like a lot of different quadrats in the same area, and then you can average them out. So on average, you might say you have about 4.5 crabs in a quadrat, and then you can multiply that by the number of square meters you have in that ecosystem, that region. So that's the major sampling technique we looked at right here is quadrat sampling. Here is capture, and here is mark and recapture. So what happens is you take a number of individuals from a particular environment. You mark them. So in this case, we're marking these turtles with some sort of red paint. Then you release them into the environment, and then what you do is the next day you go out and you capture the same number of individuals. So let's say you captured 10 on day 1. Then when you capture the next the next day you capture the same number of turtles, you count how many of them are marked. Well, half of them are marked, and so that seems like half of the population in total. You can use that to estimate, okay, the population is 2 times that, so it's probably about 20 individuals. I do not expect you to have to calculate, a total population size on the AP test. It's just nothing I've ever seen on the AP test before. The geographic range of a species is where any populations of a species are found. Within any particular range, there may be limited areas within that range where that species is found. So, for example, this is the geographic range of the gray wolf. And the present day range is everything that's in green. What you may see is, like, for example, here in, like, Russia, it looks like that is a large part of the geographic range, but any place where there's a major city would probably be excluded from that. So there are many factors that can influence the growth of different populations. So we can look at that by looking at a couple of equations. This equation is from your formula chart. This equation is not, but it gives you kind of similar information. So we have to define these variables. N is always going to be our population size. It's capitalized. That lets you know it's different from, remember, we have lowercase n, which is sample size. dn over dt is our change in population over time. And if you're wondering why the d's, if you've taken calculus, then it's basically like a derivative. T is time. Capital B is birth rate. Capital D is death rate. Capital I is immigration rate, and capital E is emigration rate. So all of those factors affect the population. Notice that in this equation down here, both B and I are positive values because they add to the population, whereas D and E are negative values because death and emigration subtract from the population. So here what we see in this equation is, your population at whatever time you're looking at, plus the births, the immigrants, minus the deaths and the emigrants, is going to then equal your new population after that time span. And another way of looking at it is the change in a population size. If you are simply looking at births and death rates, the change in the population size is going to be the amount who are added to the population, and then you're going to subtract away the ones who are taken out of the population who die. And then whatever number you have left over is the change in population. So for example, if I said that I had a population which had 150 births and 75 deaths, then that would mean that my dn dt would be 150 minus 75, which is 75, and that's a positive number, so my final population would be my starting population plus 75. So if this was in a population of 1,000, then my final population would be 1,075. So these are other equations. I don't anticipate you having to use them, but it's something to understand. When you are talking about per capita values, that means on average per person. So the per capita birth rate is kind of the average number of births per person. So you basically take the number of births in a population, divide it by the number of people in the population. Same thing with the per capita death rate. It's the number of deaths per member of population. And that gives you kind of this estimate that lets you ignore population size. So you can directly compare the per capita birth rate for a small population and a large population. So let's say you had a population of 50 individuals. You had another population of 50,000 individuals. If you just calculated the number of births and the number of deaths, if you had 25 births in this population and you had 200 births, or let's do 2,500 births in this other population, you would think, wow, okay, that one that has 250 individuals being born, that's a bigger growth rate. But if you look at it per capita, B for that smaller population would be 25 over 50. It's going to be 0.5. B for that larger population is 250 over 50,000, which is 0.005. So you'll see that when you compare the per capita death rates for these two different populations, it kind of eliminates the effect of judging by just the sheer numbers. You can see that, okay, in population 1, the smaller population, I had 0.5 births per person. In the second population, the bigger population, I only had 0.005 births per individual. So that means that population 1 is growing faster. You can also calculate the per capita death rate, per capita growth rate, just by subtracting D from B. Anytime you see R in the context of population, that's going to be the growth rate. So if your births exceed your deaths, then you're going to have a positive growth rate and your population grows. And just think about it this way. You're adding more people to the population than are leaving, or more organisms to the population than are leaving, you're going to have more individuals. If your birth rate is lower than your death rate, then your R is going to be negative, and then your population is actually shrinking. And if your birth rate equals your death rate, that's like for every individual born in the population, one leaves through death, then your population size is going to stay stable. So here's a sample population. We want to know the per capita birth and death rate for this population, and we're given some numbers. So in a population of fish, we have 750 fish. We have the number of births is going to be 12. 25 die. And if we're calculating the per capita birth rate, that's going to be number of births divided by n, which would be 12 divided by 750, or that would be 0.016. And then our per capita death rate would be deaths, helps if you spell correctly, over n, which would be 25 over 750, which would be 0.033. Now remember, I'm lazy. I always round to just 2 decimal points, or 2, I guess, actual numbers besides 0. There is always, if you have to do any calculations like this on the AP test, there's always a range of answers that are accepted, so that rounding shouldn't affect it. All right, so some other things will affect population growth, like the life history. Life history is basically the timing of events, major events in an organism's life that could be transitioned from one stage of life to another, like from a larval stage to a nymph stage, like what you see here in this life history diagram of ticks. There could also be like, when does an individual become reproductively active and capable of reproduction? Could be like, what's the rate of death during an individual's lifestyle? There's a lot of things that can be counted as part of life history. These things tend to affect population growth rates. You can see them in something like this, which is called a life table. And it's showing you, let's say in an average, like they're looking at, in this instance, they're looking at 210 cactus finches that were born in 1978. And they marked them so that they could track and see how many of them were still alive a year later. So at a year, 43% of those birds were still alive. The fecundity is the average number of offspring born per female of a given age, but we're going to ignore that for now. Let's just look at survivorship. By the time those birds, that group of 210 birds, hit age 2, there were only 37% of them left. By the time they hit age 3, there were only 33%, then the next year 31%, the next year 30%, the next year 20%, the next year there was a drought, so it dropped dramatically to 11%, the following year 7%, 7%. So after 9 years, only 7% of those original 210 birds were still alive. Notice that by this point, the fecundity is going up, and notice when it also hits a peak and a very low amount. So when there was drought, there were fewer babies, because this is the average number of young born per female. So conditions were poor, they had fewer babies. Conditions were good in 1983, so they had more babies. That's where you had the maximum fecundity. So looking at these types of things, survivorship, what fraction of an original group that are born in the same year survive to a certain age, fecundity, average number of offspring produced, and then there's also mortality, which is the fraction of individuals that die. So all of those things are part of an organism's or a species or a population's life history, and can affect the population growth rates, population dynamics with other species, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. So, if you have a higher fecundity, this is basically how fertile you are. So every time you see fecundity, if you're like, I have no clue what that is, just substitute the word fertility. So a higher fertility rate and a higher survivorship will increase your population and your growth rate. More organisms surviving, more babies being born means more population. Another thing is, if reproduction shifts to earlier ages, the population growth rate increases. So in some species, the age at which an organism can start to reproduce is fixed, but in most of them it adapts to the environment. So if you're in an environment with plenty of resources, then organisms might start to reproduce earlier because they have enough energy to not only fuel growth, but also to fuel the production of babies. Related to this is something called a survivorship curve, which is a graph you may or may not see on the AP test. Basically, what they're doing here, notice they say number of survivors. Doesn't matter, but it's a log scale. And then they have down here age in relative units. What that is that's relative to the maximum lifespan. For a human, that might be about 100 years. For a bird, that might be 30 years. For a tree, like what you see here, that might be 200 years. It's not that we're looking at their survivorship at each year. We're looking at it at each kind of major stage in the organism's life. So this is really closely related to reproductive strategies like R and K strategies, which if you remember from freshman bio, is do you take care of your offspring and have quality over quantity, raise a few, but raise them well? Or do you have a crap ton of offspring, like an R strategist does, have a lot of offspring, quantity over quality, and hope that some of them will survive, but you don't really care for those young very much? So, a lot of R strategists tend to be early loss type of organisms, where they will produce a large amount of offspring, but very few of them will end up surviving to maturity. So if you think about a tree producing acorns, a tree will produce hundreds of acorns. Out of those, most of them will not land in a spot where it is going to be convenient or ideal for them to end up germinating and then growing a new tree. Out of those saplings that grow, some of them may get destroyed, some of them may get, eaten, some of them may have something happen to them. So a lot of these will not survive as well. So when you look at reaching relative maturity, like an actual mature oak tree, you're going to find that only a tiny fraction of the original number of offspring, which in this case were acorns, would actually survive to adulthood. But the ones that do survive to adulthood survive for a really long time. Once a tree reaches a certain stage of growth, unless something catastrophic happens like a fire or a human with an axe, that tree's going to stick around for a long time. On contrast, you've got late lost species, which are K strategists, and they will produce few offspring, but those offspring will survive really well. So humans are an example of this type 1 late loss survivorship, where we have babies, and most of those babies will survive all the way through to adulthood. However, later in life, there's going to be an increase in the death rate. So as you get closer to this maximum age that humans can reach, more and more of the organisms are going to die. And that would be a K strategist. There's also a constant loss, or type 2, where it's the organism's chance of dying is kind of about equal anywhere in its lifespan. So those tend to be kind of mostly R strategists, but I believe they're kind of intermediate. So you can also have subpopulations, smaller groups of organisms that interact more directly within, a larger group of populations. Basically, if there's a patchy environment, so for example, here we see, this is, I believe, a water flea, or a Daphnia. And it can exist in all of these ponds. They may be interconnected by small streams. during the dry season, they may be isolated from each other, and so they form these subpopulations that can be genetically distinct, but are still capable of interbreeding with the larger population, and that you can also have individuals migrate from one population to another. This is especially important in species whose habitats have been broken up by things like, say, human activity, so it helps them kind of maintain not only species diversity, but also maintain the fact that they're the same species without a reproductive barrier. So, if you have organisms living in smaller subpopulations, if they're a small population, remember, you have all of those things like genetic drift, you have, you know, possible accidents that could destroy that small subpopulation. They may go extinct in an area. However, individuals from other subpopulations can then move in if the environmental conditions are good enough for that species or are still viable for that species. Then other individuals can move in and repopulate the area. You can also have immigration coming in. So immigrants come in, contribute to the genetic diversity, and add in new alleles, and that will help combat any genetic drift or anything else that occurs because of smaller population size. So a lot of the adaptations that an organism has are going to be particular to helping them gain and keep energy and matter in a particular environment. So in an ideal world where there are no limits, where there's unlimited resources, unlimited space, populations would grow exponentially. And in fact, when you have a population settle in a new place, unless there's already extreme competition, initially their population will grow exponentially. However, as more, so like this, it says, as more individuals are produced than can possibly survive, there is a struggle for existence. That is the very essence of natural selection. So at a certain point, you start having competition for resources. And at that point, this curve of growth starts to slow down. And instead of forming what we can call sometimes a J curve, because it just shoots up, you form instead an S curve, which is also known as the logistic model, which is the more realistic growth model. And then as you approach the limit of organisms that can be supported by that environment or the carrying capacity, your population growth basically goes to ultimately zero. All right. And of course, when there are more resources available in an environment, then more organisms can be supported by it. So for example, if you have something causing an increase in the light intensity reaching the producer population, it can increase the population of plants, which can then support an increase in the population of primary consumers, etc. And this is important because if you think about it, under normal conditions, an organism will have to spend a certain amount of energy just maintaining its body, maintaining internal environmental conditions, homeostasis, and that depends on which individual you're looking at. There's going to be a certain amount of energy that's going to have to be used to defend itself against predators or consumers, a certain amount of energy used for growth of new cells, and then a certain amount of energy that can be spent for reproduction. In an area where you have typical conditions, but there's a lot of extra resources, you still use the same amount of energy for maintenance, but now you have this surplus of energy, which you can use for other things. A lot of organisms will tend to use that for reproduction. So during times of plenty, they'll reproduce more, produce more offspring, and the population will grow. Unfortunately, during stressful conditions, like say environmental, like temperature extremes, it takes more energy to maintain homeostasis. If the temperature in an area got 5 degrees Celsius hotter, which would be really bad, then it's going to take more energy for organisms to maintain homeostasis and keep a cooler body temperature. And that leaves less energy for all of these other functions, including defense, which means they're more likely to be killed, growth, which means they won't be able to grow new cells to heal, and less for reproduction. So that's why during stressful conditions, you'll see a decrease in reproduction. All right, here is an equation for the population growth rate. Once again, dn over dt is your change in a population over time. R max is your maximum population growth rate, which if you're given a problem to calculate this, it will basically, the problem will usually give you that. And then you have n, or your starting population size. So let's say your population growth rate was 0.5 and your starting population was 100. Your dn over dt would be 0.5, which is, by the way, a very high growth rate, times 100, which would be 50. That's 50 new individuals in the population. So to find out what the new population is, you would have to add that back to the original starting population. That just calculates how many you add or subtract from the population. Keep in mind, if your growth rate is negative, this number is negative, and your population is going to decrease. All right, let's look at population density. So population density can change over time, and it can also be different over a region. So if you have a particular region in an area that is very abundant in resources, you may have a higher population density there. If that resource is less available in an outlying area, then you might have a smaller population density there. Population density can change depending on immigration and emigration, and also birth and death rates. And then species will affect each other's population. So here you see density of acorns, rodents, and ticks. And what you'll notice is that the population of ticks kind of, at least here, seems to be mostly following the population of rodents. So when there's an increase in the population of rodents, there's an increase in the population of ticks as well. What probably happened here is there was a decrease in the number of rodents, so those ticks seem to have switched to some other species that was pretty plentiful. So population growth is dependent on the density. As a population grows, your habitat becomes more crowded, there's more competition for resources, and so birth rates will decrease, death rates will increase, until eventually you reach the carrying capacity, which is where you have an equilibrium, equal births, equal deaths, equal amounts entering, equal amounts leaving the population, and that's the carrying capacity, which is, for some reason, abbreviated as a capital K. So there are factors that limit the population density. Some of those are dependent on the density of a population. Some of those are not dependent on it. So density independent limiting factors are things that will reduce the population no matter how dense or not dense it is. Usually these are abiotic factors. So things like, limits in nutrients. So plants can't find nutrients in the soil. There are pollutants. Things that are seasonal parts of climate extremes like monsoons and droughts, or dry periods, fires, hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, any of those natural disasters that can start wiping out chunks of populations are density independent. That contrasts with density dependent factors, which are usually biotic. So these will have a greater effect on the population size and higher population density. So things like disease. When you start having a high population density, that's going to make a population more vulnerable to disease spread, just because they're closer to each other and it's easier for them to pass a disease on to other people. That's why, for example, COVID rates increased more in large cities than they did in rural areas, because the population density was higher. There's also more competition for resources, and also when you have a bigger population, predators find it easier to find members of your population to eat, so that can start to decrease your population as well. So you can have changes in reproduction. So, for example, if you have increased competition, that's going to decrease each individual's reproductive success. You can have changes in survival. So increased predation decreases survival. You can have changes in mortality, like a faster spread of disease can increase the death rate. And migration, if you have increased competition, organisms can emigrate to other populations to seek resources to use. So the carrying capacity can be defined as the number of individuals any given environment can support for a long period of time. And when a population density reaches that carrying capacity, in general, the average individual has about enough resources needed to replace only themselves in the population. That puts a limit on successful reproduction. So what happens is when the population density is greater than the carrying capacity, or no, is less than the carrying capacity, my bad, misread that, then an individual has more resources so they can reproduce more than just replacing themselves. So they can cause a growth in the increase in the population. If the population density is greater than the carrying capacity, then an individual does not have the resources to produce more than one offspring, and so you're going to have an increase in the death rate. That increase in the death rate will then decrease your population density, which will then hopefully bring it under the carrying capacity. You can also have time differences in the availability of resources, which can change the carrying capacity. So something must have happened in this time span which decreased the carrying capacity, or the amount of organisms that could be supported in like 1999 and 2000. For this area, something decreased the ability of that ecosystem to produce acorns, so there were less acorns produced, and because of that there was a dramatic fall in the rodent population, which basically should have meant a decrease in the tick population, but those lucky little sons of bugs must have found someone else to eat. Alright, so I thought we already looked at this. I think we looked at this already, and this is a sign that I did not have enough time to edit this as I wanted to. So, next set of notes is going to be community ecology, which should hopefully become